Okay, I've decided that after a major section or report, I'm going to be doing a summary or recap of lessons learned. So this will be the first of those, and this one will have to do with the Transportation Safety Board report R13W0260 pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Okay, one of the most important things to remember has to do with the laws. That acts override regulations, regulations override rules or guidelines or policies. Only acts and regulations are enforceable in court. So you have to learn to recognize how these laws are used to deceive rail families, taxpayers, and the public at large, and how they use terms like, CN has no written policies or guidelines. Irrelevant. What does the law say? What do the acts, what do the regulations say? Next, we have to know that we're being lied to in Transportation Safety Board investigation reports. So don't be naive and trust authorities blindly. Hate to say it, but that's just the way things are. Lies, deceptions, and the twisting of facts. I mean, these things are numerous and can be found throughout TSB reports if one knows what to look for. If you don't know what you're looking at and what you're looking for, and the different tricks that they use, the different strategies, when you first read these reports, you'll probably just read it, put aside, and say, okay, I guess, whatever. But if you know and you come to the report with a different perspective and expect to be lied to, you're going to read that report very differently, and your mind will right away start looking for things that don't seem quite right. And when one thing doesn't seem quite right, well, maybe another one pops up that doesn't seem quite right, and on and on and on. So if you assume that you're probably going to be lied to, it's easier for those lies to come up in your mind to be noticed, is what I'm trying to say. Because your perception and your state of mind when you approach these reports, whether or not you are conscious of that impact, it absolutely impacts how you read these things. So, point 4, trust no one, no organization, whether or not that's the rail carrier, the Transportation Safety Board, Transport Canada, the Minister of Justice. You're going to see why you really can't trust any of them. No regulator, no police agency, no member of the press, unless they have earned your trust. And we're going to get into more of those issues in other videos. That's just the world we live in today, and that's just a fact of life. So be careful who you trust. Know the players, their conflicts of interest, their legally imposed duties and responsibilities. Because when you have a legally imposed duty or responsibility, the implications of that, as far as the consequences of what we see in these reports and the lies and the deceptions, when you have a legally imposed duty to help protect frontline rail workers, as Transport Canada clearly does, there's implications to that. So you have to understand the players, their conflicts of interest, their legally imposed duties and responsibilities. Okay, next I would say pay attention to report layouts and how they impact the reader's focus and can be used to confuse or distract the reader. So, we're going to discuss this here, and then we'll, on page 2, 3, 4, and then we'll pick it up on page 16. There's a reason that things are pulled apart. Timelines are pulled apart. You see some timestamps in one area versus another. Pay very close attention to the report layout and how that impacts your focus, and whether or not you find the report confusing while you're reading it, whatever. Look for inconsistencies in reports. For example, when it says the conductor was to operate a switch, when clearly lower down it was shown that he operated two switches, TS21 and TS22. Look for discussions in reports about proposed but never implemented new rules. Why is that in there? Why would you discuss something that was never an actual rule, that never went into effect? That should be like a huge red flag. Why is this in here? It was to help with the transitions in, having your mind perceive what they wanted you to perceive in their story du jour, as they use this to make it flow more nicely and do their proper transitions, in my opinion. Okay, you should be watching out for made-to-fit definitions and switcheroo tactics. For example, making the on-the-job trainer and the supervising conductor almost seem like one and the same in a paragraph, where they're discussing the on-the-job trainer, and then right after they say the supervising conductor, almost as if they're one and the same, when these are clearly two very, very different people. Learn to read footnotes and identify odd information. A lot of people don't read footnotes. When I was in school studying finance, one of the things I had studied was real estate. And I had a teacher who used to test us on the footnotes. I got to tell you, at the time, it was extremely annoying, but that taught students a most valuable lesson indeed. A lot of times, critical information or the lies or whatever are in the footnotes. Learn to read footnotes. They're critical. So, for example, when you see things like all times are estimated, okay, that opens the door to estimating the time of the sunset. Why would you estimate a known fact? Well, we said all times were estimated. So what if we're off on the time of the sunset, a known fact? Who's going to verify the time of the sunset? I'm pretty sure they thought nobody would ever question the time that they provided for the sunset in Jason's accident report. But you have to learn to question everything, including things as basic as the time of the sunset. But when you see things like all times are estimated, boy, there's very little reason to estimate times in the rail industry, because pretty well everything is recorded in those units, which are found in the locomotives or via rail traffic control, radio communications, whatever. There's very, very little reason to estimate times in railway investigation reports, especially things like the sunset. Okay, let's see. And the other thing is, this reference to TCO 0-102, which and made to fit definitions in footnotes. Again, TCO 0-102 is that scam of a report, or a public scam as I call it, which resulted from the Mac Yard rail incident in 2007, and they were supposed to overhaul all training programs for frontline rail workers. This was the report that had come out of that incident as a result of a Railway Safety Act Section 19 order that had been issued by the Minister of Transportation. The whole exercise, in my opinion, was a complete and total public scam to make it look like we were doing something when in fact we really didn't. We're going to cover this whole TCO 0-102 in a lot more depth in a separate video series, because there's a lot to unpack in that. But we will be going through that, and you will see what a public scam that was. Then again, made to fit definitions. Yeah, you can find those in footnotes, just as we did in this report. Then ask yourself why references to certain things don't seem to fit. And again, this TCO 0-102, that document never went into effect because the previous regulation it was supposed to replace was never repealed or revoked. So Why would there be any reference to a document that never went into effect? Any rules or whatever that were in there? Why was that in there? You know, if something is telling you, this seems kind of odd, why are they referring to this? There's a reason. It's for the story du jour. Because these things, you know, like TCO 0-102, in my opinion, provide good documents from which to pull information or a sentence or a paragraph here and there. They're pulling information from totally bogus reports that never went into effect in order to now, in a death investigation report years later, help with their story du jour as they lie to taxpayers and rail families. So be careful of that. Ask yourself, why is stuff like this included in reports? And then also sections 6 to 9 of SOR 87-150, that entire section in there where we saw in that one video that it referred pretty well to the locomotive engineer trainees and not the conductor trainees. Why was that section 6 through 9 included in this railway investigation report? And is that because there might have been a manager at the controls? That was my issue with this section being included, because it didn't seem to fit in this report. And so, you know, are they trying to say they're addressing an issue by not telling us what the issue really is? That maybe the issue was also with the locomotive engineer at the controls, that maybe it was a manager. And well, you know, we did include section 6 through 9 in the report. Why are they including that? So until this is confirmed or disproved one way or another, I'm still going to have that suspicion and continue to have a suspicion that maybe there was a manager at the controls when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed. And again, remember, it very much looked like this was the area where they may have been training managers at the control. The CEO for CN Rail was on a train with conductor trainee Jason Clooney a month before he died in the same area. So to me, it's a valid concern. And especially, you know, given we were not provided with the last 5 pages of the conductor witness statement, again, I still have a lot of questions when it comes to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Okay, point 11, take note of key dates. For example, the witness statements. Why is it that 3 witness statements were taken on the day after conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, and the on-the-job trainer witness statement was taken over 200 days after the incident? So pay attention to that type of detail also. And verify what you're being told. Verify everything, like the time of the sunset. Be suspicious of titles and how they impact your perceptions when you're reading a report. When you're told things like factual information, in my opinion, that's a great place to look for more lies, because we try and pass off facts when so many things clearly are not. And we're going to see a lot more of that as we get into the tribunal hearing pertaining to Jason's death, with the hearing, and that happened like 3 years after his death, because, you know, time and distance are also to the great advantage of rail carriers and regulators, right? The more time and distance you can place between events, the better for them, because who's going to care 3 years after this guy's death? Who is going to care about the hearing pertaining to his death at the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada? And when we get into that one, you're going to see again how much we are lied to. And in that case, in my opinion, the tribunal hearing had been determined and prefixed before one word was even heard. And I'm going to show you why that is, and why I am of the very strong opinion that that was the case. So be suspicious of titles, factual information, causes and contributing factors versus risks. Now, in the one video, we saw how things that were labeled as causes and contributing factors were pretty well those things attributable to the conductor trainee and mistakes he made, whereas things that were just risks, Those are the things that had to do with the rail carrier or maybe the regulator. Well, you know what? The Transportation Safety Board says that it does not assign blame. Well, when you put certain things under causes and contributing factors, you're absolutely assigning blame to a specific individual or person or whatever versus just risks. When, in the section on risks, it was stated, all the statements pretty well all started with if, if, if. It's not a thing that's for sure. It's not a fact. It's just an if, right? Whereas anything that had to do with the conductor trainee, that his mental model was off, his situational awareness, that he failed to observe, the Canadian Rail Operating Rule 104, whatever. you know, and things like regulatory oversight. Those two words make it look like there's actually regulatory oversight, when I think the argument could absolutely be made that Transport Canada, when it comes to frontline rail workers and their safety, has not done its job in decades. And I mean decades. We are going to be looking at that a lot more closely when we look at report R07T 0270, which had to do with the backyard incident, and how far back Transport Canada has known about these issues and did virtually nothing. So again, watch out for the titles and how they impact your perception as to how things really are. If I tell you it's a fact, you're going to probably believe it's a fact. You won't question it. Learn to question. Next, point 14. Notice when assumptions replace known facts. That whole situational awareness discussion, and yet we exclude known facts like wrong switch numbers, TS 21, 22, and 23 versus TS 12, 13, and 15, completely left out of the TSB report. Key facts that are not properly taught in class training, such as the Canadian Rail Operating Rule 104B, pertaining to why the need to check the points, that the important part of the question on the test was left out, that it was to ensure the switch was lined for the intended route. So be very aware of things like assumptions, replacing known facts, and facts being completely left out of reports. And to get to that, you often need to do access to information requests to get to those other facts. Seek the facts that are left out, again, via access to information requests, witness statements, other reports, leaving out of the higher laws, like the acts, the Railway Safety Act, sections 18 and 19, which override the regulation section 18 pertaining to, we just need to file our changes with Transport Canada and we're good to go. No, your proposed changes must first be filed with Transport Canada for review and approval prior to field implementation. So even leaving out the higher law, which overrides the lower regulation, that's another thing. Be careful of those things in these reports, because it happens a lot. Learn to identify the lies. For example, when it states right at, and the lies, I got to tell you, they start right at the beginning of the report, like they're throughout. So when the Transportation Safety Board says that Jason had limited yard experience, when the witness statement for the OJT, the on-the-job trainer, clearly states in question 31 that he had 0 yard training. So why would the Transportation Safety Board lie to us and say he had limited yard experience? Limited implies he had some. 0 implies he had none. So crew members were qualified for their respective positions. That was basically, after the first little summary, that's basically the first line in the whole report, that crew members were qualified for their respective positions. Excuse me, but a conductor trainee by definition is not qualified and has not qualified. So to put this sentence in there, again, it twists your perception right from the start when you start reading these reports. So be very, very aware of how these things get done. We're lied to. He succumbed to his injuries during transport, when the witness statements, the HSO reports clearly show that conductor trainee Jason Clooney died of his injuries at the scene. So more lessons learned as to what to be careful of. There's much more to come. Okay, point 17, understand the industry. You know, I think the key to forcing change in the rail industry is really going to be through families that are outside of the actual work location, because it's the families that truly understand the industry. They understand things like has qualified. They understand the procedures and processes, like the training programs, which were supposed to have an instructor. They understand the costs, how a trainee is half the cost of a regular employee. So, you know, by understanding how things operate, the terms, the whole industry, it really helps you to put the pieces in place as to what's right, what's wrong, when are we being lied to, when are the facts being twisted. And so, you know, frontline rail workers, they're begging for help, and nobody's helping them. The latest negotiations, last June, both CP and CN frontline rail workers went on strike in Canada. The whole thing was referred to the arbitration process. Well, on April 7th, the arbitrator basically said, okay, you've been operating without a contract for a year and a half, so we're going to give you a 3% raise for each of the 3 years to make that a new contract. But no safety issues were addressed whatsoever. And so we're going to get into a lot of issues pertaining to safety and why it is that safety issues do not get addressed when we discuss unions and Transport Canada in more depth. But understanding the industry and forcing change, I truly believe that's going to have to come from rail families, not the frontline rail workers who are constantly being threatened with losing their jobs. You know, I'm an outsider. There's not much that they can do to me or any other family, especially a family who's lost a loved one and who may have a great interest in understanding these issues and taking these issues to the next step. And I think that's where we're at now as rail families. And I'm not just talking families of frontline rail workers. I'm talking about rail investors, rail customers. There are a lot of rail families impacted by this, including the general public and taxpayers. Next, point 18, know the applicable laws and recognize when they're being violated or broken. You know, unless you understand, this is again understanding the industry, unless you know the laws that regulate the industry, you're not going to see as well how you're being lied to in these reports. You have to know the laws that regulate the industry in order to see all of the lies in these reports. 19, be able to identify report fillers and distractors, because they're there to change your focus when you're reading the reports. Discussions, certain discussions, you know, that aren't relevant, like the rules that never went into effect. Diagrams versus pictures of switch types that don't apply. You know, there's stuff that is put in there. Oh, geez, this looks really interesting. They tell you all this information on how to install a derail. It's irrelevant. That's not how to install a derail, other than the fact that they were forced to be in between the tracks. You know, all these other steps that they provide, irrelevant. The only point that was of relevance was the fact that CN, through its general operating instructions, forces people who are installing a derail to position themselves between the tracks. And that fact is kind of left out of the report, the most important one as it pertains to the derail issues. So again, point 20, ask yourself why references to certain things just don't seem to fit, like this TCO 0-102, which never went into effect. So why even refer to those new proposed rules? Section 6 through 9 of SOR 87-150 that refer to the locomotive engineer trainees, not the conductor trainees. Why is that in there? Doesn't seem to fit. Ask to see training records or keep copies of all training and personnel records for any loved one in the rail industry who works on the front lines. I'm going to get into this issue in another series on knowing what's in your file, because there's a lot of stuff that pops up in files, as happened to be the case for my child, which is bogus information. And folks, it can cost you your job if you're not aware of what's in your file. So we're going to get into that. But training records, again, the evaluations, almost 25% of Jason's evaluations were missing. Why? Why aren't the systems picking up that evaluations are missing? So, how can you qualify a person when you don't have all the evaluations to know if they're qualified or if they can pass all of the 65 skills they're supposed to be trained in? Lots of issues there as far as training records and stuff. Okay, also learn to identify the garbage in, garbage out scenarios that are being presented as facts. So when they say radio communications were repeated as required to make it look like, okay, we're following the rules. Well, you're not following the rules if you've got a trainee working by himself in violation of the law. You're not following the most basic rule of all. So unless somebody was there to confirm what the trainee did as far as the switching operations, it doesn't matter what he communicated on the radio. If he's flipping the wrong switch and nobody's there to tell him, hey, you flipped the wrong switch or you flipped the switch the wrong way because there's no supervising conductor, it's garbage in, garbage out as far as what his radio communications are. And the fact that conductor trainee Jason Clooney also had 0 yard training, you do a lot of switching activities in the yard, and you get there's train masters there that are always doing what's called PMRC, procedures monitoring for regulatory compliance. So his radio communications and his actual switching operations would have likely been a lot more monitored in a yard scenario than out on the line. So, because you could spend your whole day maybe just putting handbrakes on, and maybe you're not the one doing the switching operations on a lot of tours. Maybe you're on a speed train where you basically get on and you get off at the destination and there's no work in between. So yeah, it's a tour, you're on the line, but you basically did nothing. There are those types of trains. So you have to look at evaluations, you have to look at the garbage in, garbage out, be able to identify that and how it fits into the puzzle. Don't assume that regulators are doing their jobs in protecting anyone, as even the Minister of Transportation ordered via the Railway Safety Act Section 19 order in R07T 0270, the watering down of regulations to new proposed rules. So, folks, if there is something that to me screams that regulators are in bed with rail carriers, this is it. That the Minister of Transportation orders the watering down of regulations into just rules. Huge point. Don't assume regulators are going to follow the law or tell you the truth, especially if the truth can lead to massive liabilities. Watch for things provided in part, be that laws. For example, when you see, the square brackets with 3 dots telling you that there's a part of the law missing there, or regulations where the effective date of July 1st, 1990 was missing when they talk about SOR 87-150 Section 5. That effective date is just missing, and then we're showing it as just a new proposed rule, right? So there's all kinds of stuff. And then rules or instructions. that are provided only in part, and ask yourself, what's missing? And what am I not being told? Because there is a lot of that in these reports. As we have seen, the facts get twisted, they get the key facts get left out, and irrelevant stuff is put in, or lower laws are put in. I mean, there's just so many variations of how they do these things to outright basically lie to rail families, taxpayers, and the general public. Okay, point 26, pay very special attention to sentence structures. This one they use an awful lot. So, and I study technical writing, so this stuff kind of jumps out at me more than it may for the average person. But things like for the qualifying trips. Again, there's only one qualifying trip, but they make it look like, by writing it this way, almost like every trip can be a qualifying trip. That is not the case. The qualifying trip is the last trip where you have that test in the field. And also how facts get twisted or how they impact your perception or focus. For example, when they say there's no requirement for the trainee to stay with the on-the-job instructor for the duration of the program. Well, when you have a made-to-fit definition for an on-the-job instructor who doesn't even go on the trips, of course there won't be any requirement for the trainee to stay with somebody who's not supposed to be on these trips. That would be the supervising conductor. So yeah, there's no requirement for a trainee to stay with an on-the-job instructor for the duration of the program. Okay, they're trying to make it look like that on-the-job instructor. Your mind will, substitute that for the supervising conductor, because most people would think the on-the-job instructor is the supervising conductor. But because they provide a made-to-fit definition, they can slip this in here and say there's no requirement for the trainee to stay with this on-the-job instructor for the duration of the program. And so he can work by himself, right? Wrong. So again, be very aware of sentence structures. And again, for qualifying trips, CN has no written policies or guidelines in place that specify proximity requirements between the conductor and the trainee. First of all, CN's written policies or guidelines are irrelevant. What does the law say? And as far as proximity, well, if that wasn't true, why did CN put out this safety action taken as a bulletin or a flash or whatever it was that reminded, employees that they must be with the trainee after Jason's death? So why would you tell them that they must be with the trainee if there's no requirement for the proximity? And that was to remind them. Well, if you're reminding them, that means you had to have told them somewhere in the past. So again, you have to, pick out what's in one section of the report versus another, because that other part on the flash bulletins, the safety actions taken, whatever, as the reminder that they must stay with the trainee, that was all separated in the report. So are you going to pick up on that as far as the proximity requirement? Then again, the when versus an if, as far as the sentence structure, and when something is presented as a fact versus something that is not confirmed, like situational awareness, where he had planned to do this. You have no way of knowing what the trainee was thinking when he was killed. So when you're replacing facts, known facts, with assumptions, there's a problem with that. And again, sentence structure, when is very different. If instead of all those risks where it's tied to the rail carrier and they all started with if, anything tied to the rail carrier or the regulator all started with an if. It wasn't a fact. If that was written with a when, that would have a very different impact on your perception of, well, who was really at fault when you're reading this report. If all those ifs had been replaced with a when, you know, a trainee is allowed to work by himself, when there is a lack of regulatory oversight. It's not if, it's a when. And the when is much more accurate. If I had written this report, it would have been very different than what was provided by for taxpayers. Number 27, consider the fact that there may be missing witnesses. Did the 19 newly qualified conductors and or conductor trainees who may have known conductor trainee Jason Clooney get fired and during a grain crisis when farmers were having trouble getting their grain to the market? I was told about these 19 that were fired by the same person who told me that the word was in the field that conductor trainee Jason Clooney was being qualified the day he was killed. Fake qualified the day he was killed because he had no yard training. So why would you be firing 19 newly qualified conductors or conductor trainees when there is a grain crisis going on and you need that labor to help bring the grain to market, as was the case when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed? I think farmers lost like $8 billion that year because they couldn't get their grain to market. So why would you be letting go so many newly qualified conductors or whatever when you need those people to push the grain to the ports? Maybe could we be getting rid of them because they're disappearing witnesses who may have known conductor trainee Jason Clooney or known of conductor trainee Jason Clooney or known of how things were being done as far as training programs and being forced to work alone when you're really not supposed to be? Is that why these 19 people were fired? You have to ask yourself that question, especially when we see that the RCMP has a problem with interviewing witnesses, as was the case in the SNC-Lavalin scandal during the Trudeau administration, when only 4 of 15 key witnesses were interviewed by the RCMP. So again, don't assume the police is going to do their job or tell you the truth, or that all witnesses that may have information to share have actually be spoken to. Instead, we seem to invent witnesses like maybe the on-the-job trainer, to provide the story du jour, and we'll get his statement 214 days after the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Why is that? Okay, here's another big one. Follow the money, honey. When you're in finance, this is always basically the bottom line. Know that regulators are in bed with rail carriers, and that's especially true when things can lead to massive liabilities. The rats kind of all get together and share their stories and make sure they're all on the same page, because there's money at stake in all of this, right? And when you see a former minister of transportation who goes to a rail carrier board of directors, and that's the same minister who had ordered the watering down of a regulation into new proposed rules. So follow the money. That's always a key one in anything. Number 29, know that safety actions taken can also be complete and total public scams and do little to actually change anything. For example, the public scam document known as TCO 0-102. The safety bulletins or flash reports that only go to those currently receiving them. These flash reports and bulletins go out after Jason died that, you must make sure that you're close to the trainee. Well, what about the new employees coming on board? If they weren't there to get those flash bulletins and reminders, they're not going to know in the future. How is something like that going to do anything to prevent a future death by allowing a trainee to work by himself in violation of SOR 87-150? It does absolutely nothing long-term to address the issues in the field. So safety actions taken, in my opinion, more public scams all too often. Just my opinion, you're free to form your own. Number 30, ask yourself, are unions being deceived? For example, the TCO 0-102 was an approved document on the union website. The TCRC is the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference. That's the union representing most rail workers in Canada, versus the version that said that the document was not in effect until the regulation is revoked on the Railway Association of Canada website, which had written that document. So is the union being deceived, or are they part of the problem? That's going to be another huge issue that we're going to get into in other videos. Then reports like the TSB R13 W0260, those are then used or modified in other judicial procedures, such as 2016 Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada, case number 20, where the lies are further magnified and extremely dangerous precedents are also allowed to be set using lies or misrepresentation of facts, making the rail industry exponentially more dangerous. And we're going to get into those, what I call that prearranged or prefixed tribunal hearing when we cover 2016 OHS TC20. Okay, here's another extremely valuable lesson to learn from everything that we've seen so far as the death investigation report pertaining to conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And that is that regulators and rail carriers or associations, well, never waste a good crisis, because even the death of a rail worker or a rail incident like the Backyard incident of 2007 can be used by Transport Canada and rail carriers to further water down laws that are supposed to be there to protect frontline rail workers, or to set very nasty precedents, as we'll see in 2016 OHS TC20. So, you know, all these groups that have huge liabilities, you know, you don't want to ever waste a good crisis. It's an opportunity for them to push their agendas, their weaker laws, their nasty precedents, whatever. And the public needs to know that, and rail families need to know that. And I don't mean just frontline rail workers. I mean the public, rail investors, rail customers. You had better all know that this is happening, and it's clearly evident in the case of conductor trainee Jason Clooney and the Backyard incident. So both are tied because they both have to do with training programs, etc. And here also, question everything. In my opinion, quite frankly, if you would have assumed almost everything you were told was a lie in R13W0260, the investigation report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, if you had assumed everything was a lie, I suspect you may have been closer to the truth than if you had assumed you were being told the truth by those who wrote this report and or approved it and or signed off on it in the interest of furthering rail safety issues. And that would include the Transportation Safety Board, Transport Canada, as well as the rail carriers, etc. You would have been a lot closer to the truth, in my opinion, if you would have assumed everything almost in that report was a lie. Just my opinion, you're free to form your own. Okay, as far as lessons learned here, there's another big one. Misappropriation of public funds to garbage investigations and or garbage investigation reports and or garbage hearings, as we're going to be seeing in another video series. That's all breach of public trust. And misappropriation of public funds and breach of public trust are both criminal offenses. And not only are they criminal offenses, but in a criminal offense, you know, when it's your duty, you have duties and responsibilities in these issues, you can be sued personally. That means you can lose everything you personally own. So that's a huge lesson here as we move forward. And 35, conspiracy to hide crimes, especially when there may be evidence of negligence causing death, is also a criminal offense. And you know, if you're qualifying people before they have they've completed their training program or their yard training, or if you've got things like deadly training, slide number 53, which we're going to get into as we start the next series of videos, you know, again, conspiracy to hide crimes often is viewed as something that is even worse than the act itself, the crime itself. That's just the way law is. It's often, you know, what you do after the fact that is even more punishable when it comes to punitive damages. And I think that we can absolutely agree that, given the facts of this report, that Transport Canada, the Transportation Safety Board, and the rail carrier were absolutely all part of coming up with this story du jour, all the lies, the twisted facts, etc., that were provided as a death investigation report, paid for by the public. Also, financial fraud and saying that a corporation is in compliance with all applicable laws under which they operate per the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. That, for example, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was created, I think, after the Enron scandal in the U.S. And if you are a publicly traded corporation, for example, CN Rail, and you're traded on the American exchanges, you have to sign every year that, and it's your executives that sign this, your CEO, I believe, and maybe your chief financial officer, that you are in compliance with all applicable laws under which you operate. And one of the things that the Sarbanes-Oxley Act would require is compliance audits. There's all kinds of financial audits, different kinds of financial audits, internal audits, external audits, whatever. There's also compliance audits. So a compliance audit would have to look and, you know, are we auditing the evaluation forms? Are we auditing to make sure that trainees are getting that one-on-one training and that there is, you know, adherence to the training program requirements? Are they filing, the rail carriers, all program changes with Transport Canada for review and approval prior to field implementation? Is CN Rail or any other carrier, you know, that's traded on the financial markets, they trade their stock there, and they have debt instruments, you know, are they in compliance with all applicable laws? Do they have the safety management systems in place that are required by the law? Are they following the labor codes? So all of the laws under which they operate can be subject to compliance audits. And I think you're going to find that just in looking at the case of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, doesn't seem there was a lot of compliance there when it comes to Transport Canada or the rail carrier. So, and to sign financial statements saying that you are in compliance with all laws under which you must operate, that would be financial fraud, because investors, they rely on those statements when they're making their decision as to whether or not to invest in your company. And don't forget, the government of Canada also has investment instruments on the financial markets. The beauty of finance, folks, is that in finance, there are no borders. I can buy debt instruments for the government of Canada via a U.S., you know, stockbroker, whatever. there are no borders in finance, folks. And so those debt instruments get traded around the world. And so this applies not only um, to rail carriers like CN Rail, but what about all the financial fraud being done by the government of Canada? Because, you know, if people knew how much Transport Canada has been violating its obligations, its responsibilities when it comes to the safety of frontline rail workers, if investors knew that the Transportation Safety Board is writing garbage investigation reports, or that the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada, via things like 2016 OHSTC 20, is setting nasty precedents based on twisted facts. And they know these are twisted facts, folks. I don't think you can deny that. We're going to get into a lot more of that. But that, folks, would constitute financial fraud on the part of many. And that's a huge issue. And then, you know, last point, there's nothing like a massive scandal to make investors run away and run away fast. You want to see an entire industry sector, like the rail industry sector, nosedive when it comes to their stock prices, their debt instruments, etc. Have a good scandal tied to fake qualifications and death cover-ups for frontline rail workers and see what that does to their stock price and whether or not investors want to invest in these companies, or whether or not rail carriers, or I'm sorry, rail customers may want to use these rail companies to move their goods. Just a lot of issues that I think people need to be aware of. Okay, the other point that I want to raise when it comes to the investment issues here and the liabilities is the fact that when people don't do their jobs and they don't do them right, whether or not that's the rail carrier or whether or not that's Transport Canada or the Transportation Safety Board, because they clearly did the bogus reports in cooperation with Transport Canada and the rail carrier, who both had to sign off on their report. There's another huge issue, and that is the fact that if Transport Canada or these rail carriers don't do their jobs, people move around. And these are international corporations. And so when you don't address the issues and you allow perpetrators to get away with, you know, violating so many laws, and those perpetrators can then go to another rail carrier, potentially in another country, in the US, to infest, you know, class 1 rail carriers in the US. And this, folks, has absolutely happened because of this rail scandal and the fact that CN, Transport Canada, the Minister of Justice, and so many others did not do their jobs. And so the infestation of these problems has now moved to also include a lot more Class 1 rail carriers in the U.S., impacting all those frontline rail workers and all those rail investors and rail customers. There's a huge problem when people don't do their jobs when it comes to matters of safety and following the law. You know, the government of Canada, maybe it's, you know, and all its crown corporations and whatever, they're not above the law. They are under the rule of law. And so to allow them to consistently violate the law and not do their jobs and their legally imposed duties and responsibilities, and to allow all this financial fraud to continue, there are a lot of issues here, folks. And the fact that this has now spread to the U.S. rail industry makes it exponentially worse for the players who allowed this to go on for so long. Okay, as we conclude this video on lessons learned from the TSB report R13W0260, clearly there are many more lessons to be learned as we continue with this, what I call the dissection of a rail worker death investigation. And again, I just want to give you this visual here. You know, this is what taxpayers paid for. And I hope you can see all the red here on this report, okay? There's clearly problems when we have a Transportation Safety Board report that, you know, it just has so many issues in it that if you, again, assume that everything you were being told was a lie, you'd probably be closer to the truth. That's my humble opinion. You're going to be free to form your own opinion, but I think as you see that we move through other reports tied to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, that, you know, there is no denying that there's a lot of issues here. I mean, you know, if you saw just a few things in red ink, that would be one thing. But when you see so much red ink in a death investigation report, I think that pretty well all of us can agree there's a problem with this. And taxpayers have been paying for these reports. That is clearly misappropriation of public funds. There's no other way to put it, and that is a complete and total breach of public trust. And actually, folks, this is where the report ends, but there's so many issues with this. I actually have another version where I added, I think, 4 or 5 other blank pages with my handwritten notes because I couldn't get them all in on this report. But I did want to give you that visual so that you can see, you know, we have some serious issues with the Transportation Safety Board, with Transport Canada, and with rail carriers. And the bottom line is, folks, we're being lied to. And if Transport Canada is lying to us in matters pertaining to the rail industry and the Transportation Safety Board, I think we also have to ask, what else are they lying to us about? What about aviation accidents or marine accidents or trucking accidents? You know, can we trust the Transportation Safety Board and Transport Canada given what is being revealed via the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney? So coming up next, I'm going to get into the deadly training slide number 53. That's going to be a whole series of videos too, because I have to set it up and there's a lot of setup to that one. But again, you're going to see there is just so many problems with so much. But on that one, I hope you're having a great day, and I will see you on the next video series. Okay, so again, if you can, like, share, and subscribe. I hope you are enjoying these videos. They take a lot of work to put together and stuff, but it's valuable lessons that I just feel have to be shared with rail families, and I mean all rail families. So let's hope that we stand united and we build strong ties through some very hard truths. So have a great day, and I will definitely see you on the next one.